Hello students, Mr. John here. Welcome to Chapter 19, Lesson 2. We've got lots to go over. Today we hit on some subjects that you might be a little familiar with. We've got knights, we've got lords and ladies, and of course the feudal governmental and economic systems. Woo! Alright, that last one you might not be as familiar with, but after class today you know all about the feudal system. Let's hit it up. So in the last chapter, we talked about the rise and fall of a few kings and kingdoms. We talked about guys like Charles the Hammer Martel, Pepin, Charlemagne, people like that. Basically, these were fluid and uncertain times. In general, you could not count on a central government to protect you. As a result, people began to rely on their local nobles for protection. In return for this protection, the people would work for the local lord. This gave rise to a system of government called feudalism. This pyramid right here, very important. By the year 1000, Europe consisted of hundreds of small feudal territories. At the center of each was a lord and his castle. Also, you can kind of consider the words nobles and lords somewhat synonymous. In the Middle Ages, there were nobles and there were peasants. Nobles pretty much ran everything through the feudal system, and this feudal system relied on loyalty. So the pyramid above illustrates the feudal system. The ruling class, called the nobles, are everything but the bottom. So noble, noble, noble. Peasants. There were differing levels of nobles. You can see here, different couple levels. At the top you had a king, and he ran the big show, although somewhat loosely depending on where you are in history. Below to the king would be the lords. The lords were bound to serve the king and provide soldiers and protections if needed. The lord would give their own land to the lesser nobles in return for their loyalty and protection, just as the nobles did for the king. A noble given land by a lord is called a vassal. And the land itself, this sort of mini kingdom within a kingdom, is known as a fief. Pronounced fief, not fief. So you've got the king at the top. These are all nobles. You get the king at the top. Underneath the king are lords, and lords basically give out their land to lesser nobles who are called vassals. And you are that lord's vassal. It's sort of like you're like a sub-governor almost. You've got a big chunk of land that belongs to a lord. That makes you a vassal. Now, many of these lower-ranking nobles were actually knights. Knights are dedicated to war and served as basically the elite soldiers of that age. They were essentially heavy cavalry. They lived and trained by a code of conduct referred to as chivalry. Chivalry stressed bravery, loyalty to one's lords, being proper to noble ladies, and things like that. Much of what we know as proper manners and behavior now originates from chivalry. Knights maintain their fighting skills, by partaking in tournaments. The most popular event at a tournament was the joust, and I put a video here of jousting, but I think a lot of you know what that is. So this whole feudal system, the rundown real quick. The lowest of the nobles were the knights. They weren't always knights, but oftentimes these vassals were knights. The vassals were given land by lords, and the lords were ultimately loyal to the king. So the knights had to be loyal to a lord, and the lord had to be loyal to a king. So if a king was in danger from an invading force, he would call upon his lords to defend him, and then in turn the lords would call upon their knights. They'd say, "We need you," and the king needs you. So the knights were ultimately loyal to their lords as well as their king. So it was a system of loyalty. These vassals were loyal to these lords, and the lords were loyal to the king. Now, we're going to get to the lower class, the peasants, the serfs, in a moment. So each knight, lord, and king had a castle, generally located centrally within their land. It was part fort, part government building. They'd basically run things from there, be protected, and hold court. Sort of like open hours, office hours, if you will, in their castle. There's a few different types here. In the book, it talks about the motte. Here's a motte and bailey castle. See Big Hill. It's called a stone keep. It's like a fortress within a castle. And then these concentric castles are a bit more in depth. Let's talk about the medieval manor. So the manor is like a small town within a fief. So like a knight, a lower vassal, might have a fief. I'm saying it wrong. It's fief. They're going to have their fief. At the center of the manor is their castle. Then there's the nearby village, and with all the peasants, their houses, and the farms, and maybe a church. So that is the manor. It's like the town within the fief. Now we all need to talk about the vast majority of the population, the peasants. There were two types of peasants. Serfs were tied to a noble and the fief. They weren't quite slaves, but they could not own land or move away. They needed permission to marry from the lord, whoever was in charge of that manor and fief. They had to protect the fief in the event of attack, so basically serve as foot soldiers or archers. And the serfs worked the lord's land 3 days a week, and the rest of the week they could work their own land. But they had to give a portion of their own crops back to the lord, so they given a lot to the lord. They also had to pay the lord to use things in town like the wine press or grain mills or anything like that. It's basically hard work being a serf. The other type of peasant was a freeman. Freemen generally rented land from a noble, so they're paying for it, but they weren't tied to the land. They could keep their own crops, they could move if they wanted to, and even had basic rights under the law. Most peasants were not freemen, but most of them were serfs. Serfs could technically buy their freedom, but this was difficult and did not happen often. If a serf ran away from a fief and escaped to a town and successfully hid for 1 year, they were then considered free. Moving on to the life of a peasant, peasants lived clustered around the village green. Think of it like a big common field at the center of town. The peasants worked year-round, planting, harvesting, and butchering livestock, maybe shearing sheep. They grew beans, peas, barley, and oats. They went to church on Sundays and would on occasion have a festival in the village green. There were wrestling matches and archery contests were popular. Women helped in the fields, raised children, and prepared meals. Common foods included bread, vegetables from the garden, milk, nuts, fruit, and ale. The ale they drank was much heartier and less alcoholic than what we think of as ale today. We think of ale as beer, but for them, ale was the staple of their diet. It was like a meal substitute drink, kind of like one of those morning breakfast shakes you might drink. Now, some big improvements to farming occurred during the Middle Ages. They used the iron plow to break up the tough clay soil. And with the horse collar, they could put the plow on a horse, and then the horse could pull the plow instead of them having to push it themselves, which was a big help. Crop rotation was a big help. They subdivided the land in the manor into 3 sections. They would plant 2 and leave 1 to go fallow, and then they would rotate this fallow field every season or every harvest season when they would replant, and then that way they wouldn't wear out the soil as quickly. Give it time to get some nutrients and minerals back. Now, after the fall of Rome, there was a period of chaos. Roads and bridges fell into disrepair, and there was no one to stop basically thieves and bandits. By around 1100 AD, nobles had picked up these duties. They were maintaining roads and basically being a police force. Some peasants began making metal and cloth goods that the nobles wanted to purchase. So we've got some skilled people here, some skilled peasants. So there were a number of cities and towns that were somewhat autonomous from feudal rule. That is to say, they were not totally under the control of the nobles. Examples of these places, first one off the top of my head, and first one listed in the book, would be Italian cities. Italy was a little different back then. So you've got cities like Venice, Pisa, and Genoa. There were a few Western European cities as well, like Ghent. These cities had a middle class, so instead of just upper and lower, there was an actual middle class, and it was made up of peasants that had acquired a measure of wealth as a result of their skill. Some of them were skilled artisans, people like blacksmiths, maybe some people in the business of making clothes, basically goods that nobles wanted to buy. They had a good that they could make that people wanted to buy. As a result, they acquired wealth and therefore they acquired a measure of power. You also had merchants and bankers. People started to use money. So this middle class in these cities and towns resented being controlled by nobles. And with their money, skill, and power, they were able to create their own governments. Towns were often run by a council and had secured basic rights from a local noble on whose land the land resided. So even if the town was in some nobles, I'm losing it. I'm losing the word. In their fief. Even if the town was in their fief, within their block of land, the town has some sense of autonomy, independence from the noble. So they were strange places. Hence, if you escaped to a town, you could be free if you were able to hide for a year. Once again, a strong middle class secured freedom from, really, it seemed pretty oppressive if you ask me. Take note, strong middle classes create independence and freedom. On the subject of medieval towns, they were kind of gross. There was no plumbing, so sewage was in the streets. They were dense, tightly packed wooden buildings crammed together. Fire and disease spread pretty quickly. The air was filled with ash and smoke. All in all, they were not clean, healthy places. Women in town would help their husband run the shop, and in some cases, if the husband died, the woman would take up the business. But other than that, they basically did the same thing as peasant women everywhere. Raised children, prepared the meals, helped out with work. In the towns, you had these things called craft guilds. This is when all the men of a certain craft, like the blacksmiths, say, or the shoemakers, or the clothing makers, whoever this craft happens to be, all the people in that craft would band together to set prices, set standards for the goods they were selling, and then regulate their trade. They would also make decisions on who to take into the trade, accept or not accept, as basically an apprentice. So an apprentice, if someone wanted to be a blacksmith, they had to be accepted by a blacksmith or whatever the craft happened to be, a master. They would live with that person. That person would teach them the trade. They wouldn't get paid, but they would get to live there, and they would basically take care of this apprentice. Once the apprentice got good enough at the skill of the craft, they would become a journeyman, and they would work for wages for that master, and then they might go on to have their own shop someday. And then they would be the master, and they would take on apprentices and journeymen. And that's the craft guilds of the town. They became somewhat powerful organizations. So that's our lesson for the day. So you've got this feudal system, and then you sort of have these towns off on their own because they have a strong middle class. We've talked about knights, lords, and ladies, and that feudal system. That pyramid on the former page is a good graphic to help you understand this. You've got the kings at the top. We don't talk much about them. The lords have a lot of land. They parse that land out to lower nobles that are called vassals. So they are a vassal to that lord, and oftentimes these vassals are knights. And then all the lords have serfs working for them that are tied to that fief, tied to that lord. They can't go without permission. They have to stay there, and the kids stay there, and they work the land for that lord, whoever they be, a knight, a lord, some type of vassal. And in turn, they get protection, but they have to give a lot of their goods, a lot of what they've sown, to that lord in return. All right, we have a basic quiz on the next page. 10 points, 5 questions. And then tomorrow, we'll start with Lesson 3, which is, a lot of history. A little less general, more specific stuff. It's called Kingdoms and Crusades. We're getting into the Crusades. All right, that's it for today. Have a good one. Let me know if you have any questions.